The 49ers have hired a defensive coordinator. Kyle Shanahan has made the call. Steve Wilks is the 49ers' new defensive coordinator. Wilks, of course, was the Panthers coach this year. Interim head coach. He was he was not the defensive coordinator. Maybe it was pass game or run game coordinator, and maybe assistant head coach or something like that. But then, of course, he took over after the Niners got Matt Rule fired and had a pretty good year, all things considered, down the stretch. He was the Cleveland Browns defensive coordinator previously. He was the Cardinals head coach. Obviously would have coached against the 49ers back in the 2018 season. He was Carolina's defensive coordinator before that. So Shanahan does have, I'd say, a pretty healthy history having coached against Steve Wilks. He's universally appreciated by Panther players, at least the ones on record about him. I watched quite a few interviews, read quite a few quotes. They seem to like him.
Felt like they wanted him to get the job, which, a lot of times players want their interim coach to get the job. And it felt like him and Frank came down to it like it came between those two guys. I mean, he almost was a head coach in the NFL for the second time. And I was hard on him for his one time as a head coach. And listen, Vic Fangio's a $6 million defensive coordinator right now. He's just not a head coach. Like, just because you're not a good head coach, or maybe you go to a terrible situation, does not mean you're a good position coach. These guys are really lucky that, the salaries are, Steve Wilks probably making $2.5 million, so being the number two, especially in this situation, is an incredible job. Now, he looks, you and I were both saying, and sometimes it's the gray, he looks a little older than he actually is. I would say by his picture, I was like, God, there's, a little older, 60-year-old. He's 53 years old, which, historically was like right when guys became head coaches in the NFL. So, the 49ers, I would say defensively, they started this thing in 2017 with Robert Saleh and had D'Amico on the staff. So their two defensive coordinators had been here the entire time, right? When Robert got the job, they transitioned pretty seamlessly into D'Amico. This is the first time I'd say like legitimate pressure on just an outsider coming in. Obviously they don't have no matter what, there's no change on the offensive play caller, but the defense, which has been since they got good in 19, has been, a major reason they have been really good 3 of the 4 years. And even the year they sucked in 20, their defense was pretty fucking good. So the standards are pretty high, I would say, defensively. It's a fantastic job to take, but it's also a pressure job to take. Yeah. There's no like next year 9th in the league in defense. That's probably a problem.
Yeah, it's D'Amico was promoted from within, like you said. Robert Saleh, they all came from the outside. But, the situation that Robert Saleh came into was very different. In part, that was 2017. Those were different players, by and large, than are here now, with a couple guys, Eric Armstead, Jimmy Ward, although Jimmy might be gone. I
think he's gone.
That defense was 27th. He was taking over the defense that had been 27th in the league in points per game. That's not the situation that Steve Wilks is walking into, right? Steve Wilks is walking into, by many metrics, the number one defense in the NFL, which obviously makes it an attractive job for him, but it also makes it a very interesting job to hire for. Fred Warner and Nick Bosa and Eric Armstead and Emmanuel Mosley, maybe Mooney Ward,
Greenlaw,
Greenlaw, yeah. Like these guys, and Chris Kasarik. Like, it's not just the players, it's also the position coaches. Like, they know what they're doing. They know they're really good at doing what it is they do. So as you called it a risk before when you and I were talking, I think you're right. Like, this is a very, like, you need a guy who can command a room, who has confidence in what he does as a coordinator, and can hit the ground running, because this group would sniff out a fraud very quickly. Or not even a fraud, just somebody who's not ready for the moment or is a little over their head. And that's not what Robert Saleh walked into. It is kind of what D'Amico walked into, but D'Amico has, a very good rapport already with a lot of guys. And as it turned out, he had the goods. So
and had just known every guy that was starting personally, right?
Right. They had reason to believe in him.
Yeah,
I think that Steve Wilks brings a lot of legitimacy to the position at a time when you really probably would have been taking a risk if you were bringing somebody in to coach guys who already know they can be the number one defense in the NFL.
Well, I think it's fair to say that they needed a guy who'd been a defensive coordinator. They couldn't take a risk with a first timer. D'Amico was unique because, like I said, he was on the staff. You couldn't take a first timer from outside. That's, I think trying to make up a pitch on the fly in the World Series. It's just you couldn't afford to screw that up. And Kyle's had a pretty good track record, right? I mean, the last two defensive coordinators are head coaches in the NFL. And this is a guy that, I mean, he clearly people think highly of him, runs the same defense, which I would say is clearly very important to Kyle. He's verbalized that. He now is backing up through his actions. And probably ultimately why Vic Fangio is not the coordinator, because that was the guy. But from defensively, from schematic standpoint, like he wants to run a 4-3 defense. And this guy runs a 4-3 defense and gets an incredible opportunity to, I would say, get himself right back in the mix of being a head coach.
Yeah.
Right.
Yep. Absolutely. I think it would be very easy because, like you said, he's still relatively young. And it's very easy to say the two situations he's had. One was as the head coach with the Cardinals. Now maybe they're going to hire one of the coordinators from the Super Bowl, but they've yet to hire a coach. And the other was as an interim with the Panthers. So you could easily make the case that he's not had the opportunity yet to really, take over a franchise.
I think sometimes, unless you're really there, like talking to a player or scout or someone in the building, he went 6-6, which I would imagine over the last 3 or 4 years, the best stretch the Carolina Panthers have had. But like, is there just a natural jolt of, a coach being gone? And remember, Tepper fired several coaches. You remember a lot of the guys that Rule had brought with him. I think, Snow, who was the defensive coordinator that he had brought from Baylor, he got fired. So Wilks then became the interim and kind of obviously takes over the defense essentially. But it's pretty clear, like Kyle had his eye on this guy and was yesterday talking to him on Monday, just ultimately a formality.
Maybe. I would think Kyle puts a lot of stock in having coached against the guy, right?
And I'd say most good coaches do.
Yeah, and you should put a lot of stock in that. You know how the other guy creates problems. And, Kyle's hiring a defensive coordinator at a time when he plays a lot of teams that do what he does. So he knows specifically the Rams in his division do what he does, right? The Seahawks have some of what he does offensively. So he wants some of that. What works against me? Because we got a bunch of other guys out there trying to be me.
You know what David Tepper loves doing is, he takes Frank over Wilks, which I got no issue with. Frank has proven more than Steve Wilks. If you just I need the safest hire, Frank is a safer hire than Steve Wilks to make your head coach. In fairness to Steve Wilks, who, again, I was very hard on. His 1 year, Steve Keim, who's got some issues going, Josh Rosen's rookie season, I mean, it was a disaster. They were fucking terrible. Remember, they had the number 1 pick the following year, and that's when Cliff came in. They get rid of Josh. But he hired, Frank's going to claim Frank hired him, but I feel like Tepper, the UC Davis, Avero, the defensive coordinator from Denver, just who's the best defensive coordinator? He did the same thing when Rule with Joe Brady. It's just he just looks at the stat sheet. Let's go hire this guy. He's available. He loves doing that. And I'll give credit to Kyle. He's not really into that. He's into what makes sense in his building. The personality really matters. Now, I need you to know what you're doing, but I'm not Belichick. I'm not just tied on the people I know. It's a little, Andy does this. It has historically, when he hired Jim Johnson with the Eagles, he just coached against Jim Johnson. And he just thought he was really good when he was with the Green Bay Packers. And I forget where Jim was, but and then from a personality standpoint, coaches, very small fraternity. So I bet Kyle had a pretty good idea a lot about Steve Wilks before he ever first talked to him on the phone, right?
Yeah.
Probably was developing a short list last off season when D'Amico was interviewing his first go round.
Yeah, I mean, exactly. He would have had to, because he predicted it would happen with D'Amico, and then last year it nearly did. Wilks did beat the 49ers in his 3-13 year with Josh Rosen. CJ Beathard's 54 pass attempts that day could not overcome the Cardinals. 349 yards, 2 touchdowns, 2 interceptions, 4 sacks. And I
think Josh Rosen, Josh Rosen, they beat the 49ers. They beat the Green Bay Packers because the night that Steve Wilks' team beat the Green Bay Packers, pretty sure they went 3-13. Yeah. That was the last game Mike McCarthy ever coached for the Green Bay Packers. He was fired that night at Lambeau Field, if I remember correctly.
Yeah, Joe Philbin. They fell to 4-7-1. Philbin coached 4 games that year. So that about looks like it adds up. Yeah, good memory.
I don't remember what happened a week ago, but I remember the night Mike McCarthy got fired and what team he got fired against.
Who could forget where they were when McCarthy got run out of Green Bay? I'm sure Aaron's press conference that night was very good. Part of the job, I think, if you're Kyle Shanahan's defensive coordinator so far, has been to be a little different than Kyle from a personality standpoint. I don't know. I don't know enough about Steve. I've watched him talk a little bit, watched some locker room speeches. He seems a little more. I mean, D'Amico and Saleh are both very buttoned down. They're just more excited. I would say I don't know. I don't know what Steve's vibe yet is. Hard to tell. It'll be interesting to see if he brings a little more of a. I'd say Robert and D'Amico have a little more of a. They smile easily, a little sunny disposition. I don't know that I've seen Steve on the sideline smiling much, but I know I've never really seen Kyle smile much on the sideline. So if Steve just smiles a little. I do think that's part of the Niners. Is so far part of their DNA has been their defense is just as hard-nosed as Kyle wants, but the guy that leads them has a little more pep in his step, maybe, than Kyle does. And Kyle has no, Kyle's a little more dour, but his offensive personnel has pep. Kittle has pep. Ayuk is a positive. Debo definitely exudes. Trent Williams smile. Juszczyk upbeat. So they've got a good little personality mix going there.
Danny Gray's lively.
Danny Gray's dancing in the front of the line.
I think one thing that will be tested though this year is obviously getting an outside guy, but this is an outside guy. A lot of times when a team, or I guess not a lot, it depends on the situation, but a decent amount of times there's a lot of turnover. Like when I get a new defensive coordinator, he brings his guys or we kind of rehaul the staff. This is an outside guy coming in who is, and rightfully so, forced to work with a very established defensive line coach who, from a financial standpoint, I don't have Jed's books, but there's a chance that they make the same amount of money. So this is a guy that's used to doing things a certain way. Now, that's part of the job, and a linebacker coach who, Johnny Holland's been here for a long time too. So these are... You're forced to work together. And I say that sounds negative, but it's not like, Wilks has this defensive line. That's not even an option. Like you're just kind of coming solo. Maybe he gets to bring one guy. I don't know. But the core of this team, the linebacker unit and the defensive line, that ain't changing from the message that those guys get, the way they're wired. Obviously, new healthy influences are, it's a natural thing in football, but
you could argue it's the offense that needs it more.
Yeah, but the head guy ain't listening to anybody.
Like, Kyle, now hear me out on this Croft-Reddick matchup. This is what we do.
I was at the gym listening to Lombardi. He's like, Purdy should have stepped up. It's like, yeah, I mean, fuck, why? Even if he had stepped up and the guy was coming untouched,
If the best argument for why you should have that matchup is this is just what we do, somebody from the outside might have said in the meeting, can we not do that today? Just that one thing right there today. Can we not do that today?
Is Kyle hoping that Reddick has like 3 sacks in the Super Bowl? And it's like, no one can block him. Guys, what do you want me to do?
Yes. Yes, he probably is.
Does it make it look better if he's the Super Bowl MVP?
Yeah, although I think it looks worse. I think you kind of, in a weird way, Kansas City winning this. You don't want to have. I think it's painful if you lost to the Super Bowl champs that way.
Well, if the Chiefs win, they also beat you 44-7.
Which, yeah, you can take that. I mean, you got blown out by the Eagles too. Let's not forget. We just pretend.
Well, I mean, you just depends who you ask.
Scoreboard was the scoreboard.
True.
Scoreboard was the scoreboard.